Hello, everyone. Okay, I'm going to attempt to give you an overview of what I am calling the early uh, conquest era. So, first of all, we need to be critical of this term conquest, think about where it comes from, why we are naming this particular era after this process, um, and think about the other terms that have been used in different moments by historians and cultural critics. Uh, Encounter, contact, periods of negotiation, the era of European exploration and invasion. These are all terms that have been used, and we can think and talk about why. But one thing that is the case is that in sort of classic historiographic periodization and chronology, calling the time period from 1492 to about 1530 the conquest era put a lot of emphasis on the earliest moments of Iberian exploration and invasion of the Caribbean and central Mexico. And it's a misnomer to call this period the conquest era, because in fact, the majority of indigenous people throughout the Americas, and in particular, we're talking about the place that became known as Latin America, did not encounter Spaniards in this time period. And to the extent that something like conquest, if that's the word we want to use, happened, and to the extent that colonial rule or colonial um, management or the establishment of colonial bureaucracies and institutions happened throughout Latin America, it happened in waves. And it happened in waves of exploration, diplomacy, war, negotiation, resistance. Um, that was not at all a foregone conclusion that involved indigenous people as much as it did Spaniards. And it happened in cycles and waves throughout the 16th century, to a great degree throughout the 17th century in parts of Latin America, and to some degree in the peripheral parts of what became the Spanish Empire in the Americas, Spanish Americas, um, even into the 18th century as well. And so when these waves of conquest, we, excuse me, want to call it that, happen, we've got disease, we've got interactions with indigenous authorities, alliances, diplomacy, we've got war, we've got violence, we've got shifting of local authorities. We've got interactions with indigenous elites. We've got exchange of information and um, cooperation and collaboration between religious and political authorities and intellectuals who are indigenous and Iberian and European. We've got all of these patterns happening in different ways and at different eras throughout uh, the colonial era. And yet, the background in terms of the kind of powers that existed and structures that existed at the center of the Spanish Americas, as well as things that are happening in Europe, is are different. These things are different. And so as these local cycles of exploration and negotiation and encounter and conquest and resistance, etc., are happening throughout the next 300 years in our story, they are happening in a different kind of global context. Nonetheless, some of the patterns that we see happen in these first um, in these first few decades of Spanish arrival to the Americas do repeat themselves. So, but this lecture, therefore, is I'm entitling First Encounters, Early Disruptions, And the subtitle is Iberian Arrival, Exploration, and Invasions, 1492 to 1530. And I'm referring to it as the early conquest era, if we want to think about it as conquest. But I think First Encounters, Early Disruptions, Iberian Arrival, Exploration, and Invasions use a lot of different language that can help open up discussion. In this first story, my focus will be largely on the Iberians that were a part of it. And part of that is to just give you a sense of some of the conquest behavior, some of the patterns that were developed that would then be spread by the Europeans. And part of it is actually an acknowledgement that this story really is, in large part, in terms of the lasting impact that it had, is a story, at least for this moment, about Europeans more than Indigenous people. And that is not because Indigenous people weren't a part of this story, and not because Indigenous people weren't enormously impacted, who the people that were a part of these that participated in and were impacted by these years. But in acknowledgement of the fact that the majority of Latin America has not yet encountered Spaniards at this time period. But right away, colonial rule and authority comes to be shaped by the experiences of these early Spaniards, and the worldview is radically changed for Europeans back in Europe, and it will lay the groundwork for everyone who arrives. Now, later, we're going to talk about Indigenous views of these very same interactions. And we're going to talk in more detail about the ways that Indigenous people participated in the colonial societies that developed after this. But this is in large part the story of the beginning of these disruptions. Okay, I'm going to share my screen and see this works. Okay. Now you don't really need to sit and watch this PowerPoint. So this is just here for people who find it easier to listen and look at something, but you should feel perfectly free to go about your business and fold your laundry and take a walk or whatever and listen to this just as a PowerPoint. My lecture notes are on Carmen. And we will be talking in more detail about other aspects of this as we go along. Okay, so first encounters, early disruptions, Iberian arrival, exploration, and invasions, 1492 to 1530. Okay, let's see, something is happening here. Why is it? Sorry, let me. Hmm. Oh, don't know what that is. Okay. Um, sorry, my computer is doing some strange things. Let's see. There we go. All right. Now I think we're on. Okay, so Spain is born. Introduction to the conquest era. So in 1492, which is where we left off when I last spoke to you, in Spain is the year that Granada fell to the Christians and also the year that Columbus accidentally runs into the Caribbean islands trying to find a passage to India. I wonder if I can move this other screen that I'm looking at so that it will not look as much like I am looking away. Sorry, I really don't. Um, there we go. That seems like it's a little better. Okay. Trying to find a passage to India. So this year marks the start of an entirely new era for the Iberian Peninsula as the kings of Castile, who have been sort of tongue-in-cheek referring to as the leaders of the Triple Alliance, Castile, Aragon, and Granada, find themselves confronted with an entirely new world that they did not think existed nor could exist. Um, So this immediate conquest and encounter period is short, however. In 1493, Pope Alexander the Sixth gives a papal donation to Spain, which gives them the right to occupy any place they discover. Um, but then Portugal is not happy about this and argues that they too were very important in the Reconquest and the Crusades and the establishment of Christianity as a unifying force in the Iberian Peninsula. Um, and so in 1494, that same pope brokers a deal known as the Treaty of Tordesillas. Um, uh, Tordesillas, actually, um, between the bickering Portugal and Spain that basically divides the entire world between Spain and Portugal. I don't think I included an image of that, but I will post that on uh, Carmen because the map is really kind of interesting. So but the Catholic kings of Castile don't get to enjoy this new reality for very long. In 1504, Queen Isabella dies. In 1516, Ferdinand dies. Ferdinand hands the by now enormous and mind-blowing reality of the New World and Spain's power over it to Charles I. In 1519, Charles I, as in the first Charles, who is the King of Castile, soon becomes Charles V, who the Holy Roman Emperor, which places Castile at the center of a huge Christian empire, the dream of the, Roman Christian Empire with Spain at its helm is to a degree, from a certain perspective, becoming true. So this empire includes all of Spain, much of Germany, the Netherlands, Italy, and all of the Spanish New World. So even though Spain was not united as a country, the reign of Charles goes a long way to doing this because as the Holy Roman Emperor, a religious but now powerfully political designation with Castile as its center, becomes a genuine empire, which includes everything that Spain will potentially find in the Americas. So details of this, can be read about in the textbooks that you've either read or I've recommended. But the point of it is that for today, between 1492 and 1519, in less than 30 years, Spain becomes the center of empire and the possessor of enormous, previously unknown territory. So this whole process includes strange encounters between worlds that can't make sense of each other, includes great tragedy, the devastation of native peoples, particularly in the Caribbean, and dashed hopes and broken dreams of Iberian people who had set out to find another route to Asia, to bring Christianity to the East and gain riches for the crown and for themselves. And it also includes a learning process, slow in some places and rapid in other places, in which patterns of Spanish and native relations are established. We want to call it a conquest society, a society that is, at least from the perspective of the Iberians who are participating in it, intent on recreating these cycles of conquest, is built successfully in some places. It fails entirely in other places. There are parts of the Americas, the Spanish Americas, where Spaniards can never be said to have successfully gotten a foothold, and resistance is permanent and endemic. And but in most places, this process is one in which Europeans learn about indigenous people, Native Americans, and Native Americans learn about Europeans, and um, what becomes arguably more true in the 17th century is that you see and there is developed a society that we can start to talk about as Latin America. That doesn't mean that local languages and local histories will disappear by any means. They still have not disappeared, but you will have an overall Iberian and Catholic inflected indigenous co-created uh, world that we can call colonial Latin America. And we will spend a lot of time talking about what this means. So the first part of the story is about the Caribbean. The story of Spain and the Caribbean is brutal and tragic and horrific. Disease and inhumane treatment of the people Spaniards encountered there led to the nearly complete annihilation of all native peoples in the Caribbean. In terms of political organization, the Caribbean peoples were organized in very local ways, ways that looked very loose to Spaniards, with nothing like the imperial religion and political structure of the what people call the Aztec Empire or the Triple Alliance, headed by the Mexica, or the Incan Empire that they would encounter later. Spaniards were confused and lawless in these early encounters. They were baffled. Columbus himself, seemingly judging from his increasingly bizarre letters to the Queen, was perhaps deranged, but was certainly capable of violent cruelty towards native peoples, and the result was utterly disastrous. It's here in these brutal, chaotic years also that we begin to see the first examples of the church's paradoxical role in this history. Columbus himself, by all accounts, was a zealous, in some moments fanatical believer. He was caught up in ideas of grandeur in which wealth and power and religious passion intermingled. I recommend you read his letters if you can stomach it, but I want to warn you that they are extraordinarily violent and graphic and disturbing. 1 in 12 Spaniards in these early years who came to the New World in the first decades were priests. The crown was genuinely concerned that the church be well represented, but we can ask why. Why would they do this? Was it a matter of religious justification? And by religious justification, I don't mean that religion wasn't a sincere motivation, but was it a matter of the crown believing genuinely that they had no right to be there if they weren't enacting the work of the church to convert people, which I want to remind you was not just about convincing people about a belief system that they thought was more correct than another belief system, nor even trying to enact conversion for the purposes of individual salvation. But it was a political, historical, theological view that Spain had a particular role in bringing about a Christian empire that would herald the end of days. And so there was when I say religious justification, I'm talking about something that doesn't separate politics from the establishment of great wealth and empire from what we would think of as religious motivations. All of these things are intertwined. So, was it religious justification? Did they feel that it was essential to begin the task of conversion right away? Why did they send these priests right away? What does it mean that they didn't just have people go and explore? Now, when they thought they were headed to India, why did they send priests? What was their goal in having priests be a part of the initial exploration and establishment of trade routes? And once they realized that they had encountered a new place, why did they continue to insist on making sure that priests accompanied every group of people? Was it to facilitate and minister to the spiritual needs of the Spaniards? Or, did they think that their efforts to gain wealth and power would fail without proper fulfillment of their Christian duties as well? These are questions that we can ask and we can use primary sources to think about. But one thing that is true, whatever the motivations were, not all of these priests acted so priestly in the Caribbean if we think of priestly action as being peaceful or nonviolent, which is not really the right way to think about clergy because clergy was really varied in its relationship to political violence and power. But at any rate, by all accounts, it was a very discouraging and morbid place. It was hard to baptize people before they died of disease or were killed. Some clergymen became cynical and tried to just extract as much labor and benefit from native peoples as they could before they died. Others despaired but thought the situation was a punishment from God and there was nothing they could do but to bless the Spanish mission and pray for native souls. But it was in this desperate context that the strongest critics of Spanish abuse also grew, and it came from clergymen who witnessed firsthand what was going on. Bartolomé de las Casas, the famous Dominican friar known as the Defender of the Indians, who was converted to his position and commitment to stop Spanish abuse of Native Americans because of what he saw in the Caribbean, is one of the biggest examples of this. He dedicated so he began as an encomendero. He after witnessing the abuse firsthand, he became an advocate for protecting indigenous people and for the development of laws that would limit individual Spanish power and that would outlaw Spanish slavery, I mean, indigenous slavery, and would limit supposedly certain kinds of labor abuses. He dedicated his entire life after the first few years of being in the Caribbean to this. He went back to Spain. He wrote and argued in court. He was individually, to a great degree, responsible for most of the protective laws that were put in place and eventually to the abolishment of native slavery. He did argue in the beginning that the way to pragmatically make the abolishment of indigenous slavery happen was to import Africans to serve as enslaved labor in Latin America. But at the end of his life, he extended his critique to the European treatment of Africans and to African slavery, and argued for the abolishment of the slave trade and abolishment of the use of African enslaved labor. And he also argued in the end that it was actually, there was no justification for political conquest, that the only Spanish presence that was justified was whatever was needed in order to protect and facilitate conversion, to protect and facilitate the clergy. And he argued that it ought to be religious orders. We'll talk about the difference between the different kinds of clergy later, but to be there and spread Christianity. Antonio de Montesinos was an early critic of Spanish abuse, and he was a predecessor. He came before Las Casas. He was another Dominican friar. Can't remember if I said, but it was on the screen. But the Las Casas was a Dominican friar, and we'll talk about the difference between the religious orders in the upcoming lectures as well. He delivered a famous sermon arguing that Native people were indeed human. There was a long debate about what kind of beings these newly encountered people were, whether they were human, and he came down on the side that they were human. And he, really blasted and critiqued the cruelty of the Spaniards that he saw in the Caribbean. We don't have the whole sermon itself, but we have reports of it by witnesses, among them Bartolomé de las Casas. And we have some excerpts of this of his description of the sermon. So these voices were speaking out against genocide, but they could not stop it from happening. So disease and violence and mistreatment of indigenous people in the Caribbean resulted in nothing less than genocide in the Caribbean. And this was, from the perspective of the Spaniards, actually a failure because, unlike the English, the Spaniards did not want to remove people from the land and claim it for their own. Most Spaniards who came did not want to work the land themselves. They had pretensions to nobility. They had learned through cycles of conquest and in the wars of the Reconquista, even if they were from very humble backgrounds. Everyone was hoping to conquer, become an encomendero, or at least, gain some wealth and power and some recognition for their role in the military exploits and to rise in status. This was, in order to do this, though, people were required because they needed to have people whose labor they could support. They needed to have people they could govern. They needed vassals. And also, from the perspective of the crown, this was also what they were looking for too. We talked a little bit in class about the difference between inclusive and exclusive um, colonialism. Exclusive colonialism is the model of the British in general, in which the idea was to remove people from the land one way or another and to be able to occupy the land themselves and build from there. Spaniards wanted to largely leave towns and communities the way they were, although that because of disease and other things that ended up not being possible, and there was reorganization of indigenous communities. But the idea was to establish rule over functioning communities and societies, to take over routes of tribute that they would actually, this would develop to a great degree in mapping onto indigenous empires like the Aztec Empire, the Inca Empire. But whatever the case, whether it was coming from the Reconquest model or the newly learned imperial model of indigenous American empires, the Spanish crown and the Spanish colonial system was one that sought to organize people into a Spanish style society, make them Christians and good, loyal Spanish subjects who would then make up the kind of working classes, the agricultural classes, um, and to whom they could work. These people would work the land and perform the labor, and Spanish society would benefit from this, and to a large degree would live in urban areas, benefiting from the labor of people in agricultural eras. So from areas, my goodness. So from this perspective, the Caribbean was a failure. People were dying, and there was nothing to live on. There was no wealth to be garnered. There was no food to be consumed. So people were eager to move on from the Caribbean Spaniards. People were restless, and many of these kind of would-be conquerors made plans to explore other places. And one of these people was Hernan Cortés, who would go on to conquer with the help of thousands of native allies, what we think of as the Aztec Empire. So Hernan Cortés arrived in the Caribbean in 1504 at 19 years old. He was involved in the conquest of Cuba, and he became an encomendero. But his trading expeditions from Cuba began to, bring information about these great civilizations that seemed to exist in the Yucatan, namely the descendants of the great Mayans. He began to get restless. In 1519, he set out for the coast of Mexico and then marched inland to Mexico City. Through a long story of much intrigue, in which he used a combination of diplomacy and force, but mostly diplomacy, to put together a huge army of native peoples who were either rivals or subject peoples to the Aztecs. So some of these folks were outside of the Aztec control or the Mexica control of the Triple Alliance, and some of them were subject peoples who were um, unhappy with Aztec rule. Um, uh, Yeah, I kind of lost my place. So he put together a huge army of these folks. And then in doing so, he also was enormously helped by translators early on in the Yucatan. Um, uh, so when he first arrived in the Yucatan, Cortes came upon a Spaniard who had been living among the Maya and who spoke Mayan, and then picked up the famous Malancin, who's also known as La Malinche, who spoke Mayan and Nahuatl among many other languages. So this, I'm getting a little distracted because this is such a rich and fascinating story. Uh, but, you know, basically, I mean, we don't know all of the details, but there was at least one Spaniard who had been captured and who had been living among the Maya and actually married an indigenous person. And Malancin, or what people have come to call La Malinche, was spoke Mayan and Nahuatl, and she had been captured um, uh, and enslaved by Mexica, and then was living in the Yucatan. Wait, I have to pause for a second because I am getting distracted, whoops, by someone knocking on my door. Hold on. How do I pause this? I'm gonna stop sharing. Oh my goodness. I can't. There we go. Now I'm gonna pause. Okay, I'm back. I had a pipe break earlier and my landlord was trying to check on something. So now, can I share once again? Share. Wait, am I sharing? I, there. I'm screen sharing. But wait, let me stop sharing and start over. I am recording, correct? There we go. All right, this is what I think I want it to look like. Okay, so uh so I would love to tell you the long story of Malancine, and some of you maybe should look into it. But basically, she was born a princess among the Nahua speakers. She was sold into slavery by her mother. She eventually made her way to the Yucatan. There's actually all kinds of, we don't know that much about her, and there's all kinds of myth and lots of different research that's about her. But she, learned Spanish and she spoke Mayan and she spoke Nahuatl, and she became really important. She became Cortez's companion. He had children with her. Um, there is a there's no way to know what the nature of their relationship is like, but there's no reason to believe that it was one of consent. But we really don't know. But she helped him as his translator and perhaps um, enslaved concubine or perhaps companion to um, make alliances with indigenous people throughout all of the places that he traveled. So the end of the story basically is that through a long and drawn out story of starts and stops and battles and diplomacy, Cortes and his army of native allies overthrew the rule of Montezuma, the leader of the Mexica and the Aztec Empire. Um, so patterns learned in the Caribbean that lasted were conquest and encomienda. So encomienda was a system by which conquistadors were granted native labor in exchange for converting them to Christianity. That was the role in terms of the official responsibilities and obligations. But the crown granted Spanish explorers and military conquerors, and this was happening throughout the Reconquest, these grants of people, basically these grants of areas where people lived and the rights to their labor in return for their role in conquest, their role in fighting Muslim rule, and now here this institution translated to the Americas. The other pattern that happened in the Caribbean that then went on and was taken to Mexico and Peru and other parts of Latin America was the out loud reading of the requerimiento that you all have in your reading, and public performances of of Christian stories, of biblical stories that utilized um, acting and symbols and things because people did not speak the language. So the requerimiento, eventually in some places, there may be some translators that were on the scene, but the main thing about the requerimiento was that it was to be read when you arrived. And so, eventually when Nahuatl was learned, there were many places in which there were Nahuatl speakers, or at least Nahuatl was a lingua franca. But for other places and in the beginning, the Spaniards, when they were arriving, they were reading Requerimiento in Spanish, and no one spoke any of the indigenous languages. So it was very much a kind of almost like a sacred magic. Ritualistic performance. They understood that the native people did not understand Spanish, but there did seem to be some sort of a belief that this was almost like a sacrament that then entitled them to the right of rule. And if you think about this in relationship to the fact that, for instance, the Mass at this time was in Latin and most people didn't speak Latin, um, there was a notion that words held sacred power, and that it didn't really necessarily require comprehension to believe that there was a divine kind of transfer of right and power uh, that was enacted through the physical and verbal performance of these rites and rituals. There's actually a really wonderful book by Patricia Seed that's called now I can't remember, Rites of Empire, Rituals of Empire. I'll look it up. And it is about exactly that. And it's about the ways that in this time period, not just the Iberians, but lots of people in the world and in Europe thought about words and actions and rituals um, as having this kind of a material effect that not only just justified, so like we've said it, now we get to rule, but also that sort of this sense of ritual power that actually changed things, that actually made something possible. And so it was not, something that they forgot to do. Like they would get there, they would plant a cross, they would read the requerimiento in with great pomp and circumstance, with great ritualistic formality. And that's something that, played out in all parts when they traveled throughout the Americas. Also, the actual construction of church symbols and church, whether they were small shrines and then chapels, and then eventually, and pretty quickly actually, church buildings and convents, the actual shape of the landscape was changed visually by the presence of the institutional church. We'll talk more about that later, but that started even in the chaotic years of the Caribbean to the extent that it was possible. So, um, let me talk a little bit about all of those things. I think I actually just did, but but here are my notes. So let me see what I have missed. The Spaniards brought with them to the Caribbean the memory and tradition of the Reconquista and the Crusades, and in this tradition, religious war was rewarded through the granting of not land but people. This is what I explained about the encomienda system. Um, it was a system that allowed for a great deal of abuse and was the main system that Las Casas and Montesinos and later other clergymen and religious orders would object to. There was a kind of great battle, or not literal battle, but contest, power struggle, which started in the Caribbean and continued on throughout the first and probably arguably second century of Spanish presence in the colonial era as well, between encomenderos and missionaries, over who would have the most power and influence over Native Americans. The crown would rule in favor of the missionaries initially, but then would also later shift the power not back to the encomenderos, but to more structured aspects of the church, which I will talk about later, and other kinds of colonial authorities. But encomenderos and missionaries who were a part of the religious orders were both very had very intimate forms of power and influence over the or with the indigenous people. And the crown, knowing that, it had to work with what it had, um, decided to, so the encomienda was very convenient to get people to conquer and to get people to risk their lives and go and explore and conquer new lands. So it was an institution that convinced people to be willing to do that. But if you left encomenderos alone, with their power, you could end up with little mini kings, you could end up with these kind of feudal lords in perpetuity, and the crown did not want that. So the way that encomendero was supposed to work was that it was supposed to only be one generation. It couldn't be handed on, and it was supposed to last for no more than 50 years. Um, there was a parallel in the sense, and I'll talk more about this part later in another lecture, but there was a parallel in the sense that the missionaries were supposed to be in charge of indigenous parishes also only for a generation or two. And then it was supposed to go back to the diocesan church, which is the structure of the church that is, beneath bishops and priests. It doesn't matter that if you don't understand that, I'm going to talk more about that later. But that part of the church, the institutional structured church, was much more regulatable and was directly, officially under the power of the Spanish king. Whereas the religious orders, who the Spanish king and the Pope gave the right to be in charge of converting indigenous people in the early years, was answerable only to their superiors in Rome and to the Pope. So there's a parallel in that the crown decides that it's convenient and expedient to have encomenderos do the fighting, and or to give people an encomienda to reward them for fighting and have encomenderos be in charge initially, and to have missionaries from religious orders be the ones who are in charge of conversion and organizing people into parishes initially. But both of those systems were too autonomous. Both of those systems threatened to have create all of these kind of little autonomous religious and political rule locally. And so the crown had right from the beginning ideas about removing this power and transferring it into more established colonial bureaucracy later. This happened and didn't happen in different parts, and we'll talk about that later. But nonetheless, there was this early battle between encomenderos and missionaries, and the crown would pretty quickly side with the missionaries, but then also try to strip power from both of these initial kind of intimate early forms of colonial power. Another pattern that was established in the Caribbean was the need for this public performance of religious justification for conquest. I've talked about that a little bit, but this was done in the form of reading the requerimiento. It was a formal statement asserting the right a need to teach Christianity and describing what they saw as native responsibilities and obligations in relation to this new religion. It was also these public performances happened in the form of planting crosses, building temporary churches as the first thing that happened, and formally giving natives the quote chance to accept the new religion. Remember, giving someone the chance to accept religion also meant that if they didn't, according to the philosophy of and theology of just rule, just war, it meant that you could wage war on them. So if you get there, you read the requerimiento, you pretty quickly build a little temporary church or at least plant a cross, teach them about Christianity, even though they don't understand, say you have the choice to accept our religion. If you do, we're cool. If you don't, we're going to war with you. That was a thing that happened right in the beginning. You know, uh, there was like little religious lessons that were a part of this initially. That when there was priests to be able to do it, even if there weren't qualified priests around to do it, then Cortés would do it or would have some of. Later we have all kinds of examples of Cortés doing it, but whomever was leading that particular military expedition would stop and would, try to do this. Um, and there were plays, there were all kinds of sort of nonverbal ways that this happened. But, most of the time this was done in a language that could not be understood by anybody who was listening. Sometimes, as was the case with Cortez in Mexico, translators were employed. But even when the words were understood, the concepts were so foreign and in many ways bizarre that they wouldn't be understood in the ways that the Spaniards had intended them to. But nonetheless, these were all patterns that were forged in the Caribbean and would travel to Mexico and then on to Peru. Cortez is a really good example of the way that religion played a role in the conquest and the ways that the lust for gold and power could be and was intertwined with a belief in the necessity of evangelization. As one historian put it so well, Hernan Cortez was a cunning and ruthless fighter, but religion played an important part in his character. He was different than Columbus in that he did not treat native peoples as inferior beings. He encountered politically savvy, extraordinarily sophisticated, and complex empires and was, by all accounts, according to his letters that he wrote, to people not on the scene, extraordinarily blown away, and impressed by what he saw. He negotiated with indigenous people as potential allies first, or treated them as enemies to be destroyed and fought with, much like you would, he was used to thinking about military forces in Europe. But however he thought about them, he thought about them as people to be taken seriously. He was a very kind of sophisticated, worldly, educated person for his time. He was cunning and pragmatic and ruthless as a soldier, but he also always felt it was necessary to stop and teach the tenets of Christianity. And this was not a contradiction for him or for many soldiers in this era. It was essential to him to meet with what he understood to be religious leaders in indigenous communities and actually, and often these people were, the intellectuals, the elites, the most learned people of indigenous communities. He identified them as religious leaders, whether they understood themselves to be religious versus political, that gets into the way that the division between the supernatural and the natural and political and religious don't really make sense in the same way that we might think about them today, nor do they really translate between the European understanding and indigenous understanding. Nonetheless, Cortés identified people as, or was told that there were people who were, something like religious leaders, something that now the historical record calls indigenous priests and religious leaders. And it was really important to him to meet with them. And often these people were not military leaders and were not political leaders in the same way that, perhaps other folks were. So he didn't just meet with Montezuma. He met with the priest class. He met with the intellectuals. He met with the spiritual experts. It was very important to him to do that prior to making diplomatic agreements and prior um, to attempting conquest. So diplomacy and exploiting opposition and resistance of subject peoples, who were upset with the imperial power to overthrow empires. This practice would also be carried on to Peru by future explorers and conquerors. It was not as effective in the Incan Empire, and that conquest story is much less complete and much longer and more drawn out. This had more to do with the diplomatic success of the Incan in establishing their own empire and holding on to it, and how angry the subject peoples of the Triple Alliance, the Aztec Empire, had become by the time of Cortez's arrival. And that's a later story. Um, uh, I'm going to end with one sort of suggestive thought about indigenous impact on Europeans, but this is a much larger story. It is hard to see because of the investments in the documents as they are written, because of the purpose that most of the letters and most of the reports had. if you can think about, they were addressed to the king and the queen, and they were, the goal was to try to convince royal powers that the conquerors and explorers had done a good job of spreading Christianity and spreading Spanish rule, etc. So they're not going to talk a lot about epistemological doubts. They're not going to talk about the ways in which indigenous beliefs and encountering indigenous people might have caused self-doubt and caused them to think differently about their own cosmological um, views and etc. But there are a few kind of tantalizing hints that show up. There's in Texcoco, there's an exchange. Texcoco is a particular part of the Nahua speaking world in central Mexico. There's an exchange in which Cortez is recalled by like other remembered by witnesses as being kind of blown away in his encounters with religious leaders and actually shaken, like shaken and maybe even expressing some doubt about, what he knows. Um, and there are other kinds of glimmers. So that, for instance, there's a story of two Spaniards who were captured in the Yucatan. One marries an indigenous woman, and then when he is rescued, by the Spaniards, he becomes a translator and a kind of go-between figure. That's the one that ends up working with Malancin or La Malinche. But there's another Spaniard who was captured by indigenous people in the Yucatan that then, never goes back, and he ends up becoming an important warrior because he knows the ways of Spaniards and he speaks Spanish and he wages war against the Spaniards and he never returns. He, marries an indigenous person and has children and becomes a part of that community. So that probably happened in other moments, but we have that story. But one of the things that I want you all to think about is just think about what it would be like to be such a tiny minority and to encounter all of these different languages and worldviews and ways of living. And even though what we have in terms of historical record makes it sound like the Spaniards were monolithically certain about their worldview, two things always make me doubt this. One, because how can that be? How can it be that you're not impacted by the world around you that is so dramatically different from the world that you came from, especially since it becomes the place that you stay for most of these people, but also because, the kind of triumphant view of Spain and Christendom is one that is intense because it is being built, it is being constructed at this moment. But I want to remind you that it is coming out of a world in which Spaniards speak lots of different languages, Iberians speak lots of different languages. They've been in different moments and times couple generations back, or maybe even in their own life histories, been living with, working with, intermarrying with Muslims and Jews. Um, so it looks like a worldview in which there's one right answer all the time, but that must be to a certain extent uh, a kind of narrative that is a construction, that is an invention, that is an insistence of something that is coming into being. And, hide, what does it hide? What kind of complexity does that narrative make it hard for us to see looking back? So, um, two legacies, the brutal beginnings and lessons of Spanish colonialism in the Caribbean laid the foundations for further conquest in Mexico and Peru. There were interplay between the drive for conversion to Christianity, empire building, and native negotiation and resistance shaped the colonial history of the Americas. If you need a kind of takeaway, those are a couple of them. Um, but what's next now for us in this class? So the early conquest period is from about 1492 to 1530, is followed by the formative era, if you want to call it that. Which I would say 1530 to 1600, in which maybe even 1630, I would say. I think I disagree with myself, the self that wrote this. I would say about 1630, in which religious and political structures develop, expectations change, colonial societies and cultures develop. Disease has an enormous impact in this formative period. Cycles of local exploration and conquest continue. The institutional and structural role of the church is enormously important, and a culture of apocalyptic missionary Christianity is foundational, but then evolves towards the end of the 16th century, the end of the 1500s. And the next two or three lectures are going to focus on these things. Okay, I will see you all soon.